Science and Ethics. She is professor and the head of the Department of Political Science at the University of Vienna. She also directs a Center for the Study of Contemporary Solidarity and a research platform on governance of digital practices. So you already see her work explores the social, regulatory and ethical dimensions of biomedicine with a focus on personalized and precision medicine, and there especially the role of solidarity in medicine and healthcare. In her work, she is very productive, not only in important papers, but also books, which is more on the humanities side, so to say. And her latest books were one on the title Personalized Medicine, Empowered Patients in the 21st Century, ? And Solidarity in Biomedicine and Beyond. So you see that is very much of interest for GHTA, as we want to host many data, genome data, and her title today, and I'm happy that you join us, Barbara, is how can data-driven practices in biomedicine contribute to healthy societies, empirical and conceptual considerations, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Eva, and thank you to all colleagues at GHGA for inviting me, and to everyone who's taking the time to come here virtually. I know that especially where the sun is coming out and getting stronger, the motivation to go to hear yet another online lecture needs to be quite strong. So thank you for being here. I'm going to share my screen. And I'm going to briefly let you know what I'm going to talk about in the remaining 25 minutes or so. I'm going to first talk about, or highlight rather, some challenges that I believe mean that the way we think about data use show that they are outdated. So some challenges around digital practices and digital economies illustrate, I will argue, that the categories and instruments that we use to govern data use are outdated. They are actually mostly from the paper age, and we need instruments that are adequate for the digital age. And I will hopefully be able to convince you and explain why that's the case. I will then talk about some research, most prominently research that we have had the privilege of doing under the leadership of Anna Middleton and Richard Milne and other colleagues at the Wellcome Trust campus in Cambridge, on what people actually want when it comes to data use in the digital era, primarily in the field of medicine, but also outside. And then I'm going to end with a couple of suggestions regarding how I think data governance should change and what exactly we should be doing. So I hope, well, I plan to not only criticize the status quo, but also give some suggestions as to how we can do it better. So, and I'm going back one slide because I should also acknowledge my dear colleague Thorsten Voigt, with whom I have been doing the work in the context of the German arm of the UDNA USA survey. I'm saying the German arm because it's not the German-speaking arm, that the data that we have used for this project were actually German data and not Swiss or Austrian German-speaking data. But I'll get to that in a minute. So, of course, with this group here, there's no need to introduce in a sort of systematic way the challenges that we are facing using data in the digital age. But I think some aspects could be highlighted more in the sense that they deserve even more attention. One thing is the very notion of datafication Very often when we use about data for healthy societies or data governance, we are starting at the point where the data are already there. But what is sometimes ethically the most challenging and what could have the biggest consequences, good and bad, is the process of datafication. So we need to start even earlier. We need to really discuss the processes by which we turn bodies and behaviors into data points. So to make this a little bit more tangible, imagine you're taking a walk around a pond 20 years ago, unless you were a very, very, very early adopter and nobody knew of your walk around the pond except people you told about or people who saw you. And also 6 months later, you wouldn't even know exactly when you took the walk around the pond. You might remember that it was springtime and so on, but not more than that. Today, of course, even if you're not writing to anyone about your walk around the pond, and if you're not posting any pictures on social media, if you walk around with a phone, then your walk around the pond would have been datafied. So there will be a record, the data will be searchable, and there will be a record about you having walked in a specific time at a specific place. So that in itself really changes the game, I think. So a lot of things that human beings have done for a long time, such as caring for the sick, moving, eating, those things were not datafied, but they are being datafied now. And datafication is, of course, not the same as digitization. So it doesn't mean that we merely do things that we used to do on paper. We now do it in a computer, but it really changes people's behaviors. It changes social, individual, political practices. So to give you an example here, for those of you who have ever used activity trackers, I think all of us can tell stories of, we look at our watch at the end of the day and we haven't reached the goal, so we're going to go for a walk, so to just get above the 10,000 threshold or whatever. So the datafication also changes people's behavior in the first place. And I think these are not just philosophical concerns, but they mean that there are structural differences to situations prior to the digital age that also challenge and change the way we need to think about governing and using data. So I already argued that ever wider aspects of our bodies and lives are being recorded in terms of data. I said that we shouldn't only talk about data governance, about data sets that are already there, but we can also talk about whose bodies, lives, experiences do we datafy in the first place? Could there be a right to not having your illness, not having your body, not having a behavior datafied? This is currently actually being debated in some circles, whether there should be a universal declaration about digital rights. And non-datafication plays a role here. Another key thing, I think, is all data are health data. So not in the same way. Obviously, there are some data sets that are very, very clearly relevant to people's healthcare, to biomarkers that describe people's illnesses and diseases, data that were collected in the health domain. But in the age of data linkage, any type of data set, wherever it was collected, and including also data sets that are not even human data, think of environmental data sets, can be used to make health relevant inferences. So if you connect a couple of data sets together, it's possible that you find that some people who have a totally non-health related characteristic in common, some behavior, have a higher risk of suffering from a chronic disease. This in turn could lead to them being redlined or even being discriminated against. Or it could also, of course, yield benefits. So it is not possible, not very sensible, I think, to think in terms of different types of data that are riskier or not. Risk is not something inherent that is in the data type. and benefits are not inherent in data type, but it's really about data uses. So what do we use data for? And I think our governance approach needs to shift much more strongly towards thinking about data uses and not data types. Another challenge is, of course, what Harry Serdin called the disappearance of structural privacy. And I think that's also very important, because that means that without anyone's nefarious plans to spy on us or to misuse health data for illegal profiling, even without any such nefarious motives, the fact that so much about our lives and our bodies is now known, our consumer behavior and so on, means that privacy is sort of retreating. This is what's meant by structural privacy. And of course, this is a sort of symbolic, almost historical slide at this point. It shows that technology companies, especially in the health domain, are taking a much, much more important role, which changes some of the power relations and structural power patterns in the health domain. Big corporate power in the health domain is not only big pharma, but it's big tech. Technology companies do not only create the software, sometimes own the data that are used for health purposes, but they also offer health insurance, try to reinvent healthcare, and I think this is very often forgotten, they, via philanthropies and foundations, they have become very important funders in the health domain. So important that that other public funders are retreating and they are sort of setting research agendas. So this is something that really is a significant change in the political economy within which we are using health data. And finally, another dimension, I wouldn't say this is necessarily a challenge, it's also something that is good. In contrast to data in the paper age, which was often in one place, it could be destroyed by shredding it, by burning it, by losing it. Digital data are very often multiple. They are in different places at the same time. This, I think, really challenges paper-age derived ideas about ownership, which always includes a particular notion of control that digital data often they are elusive to this kind of notion of control that paper in the paper age were. Also, the multiplicity of data means that the data body is very different from the physical body. The physical body, and this also relates to informed consent, given by a patient who's asked whether some procedure can be carried out on her body, has a body that is bounded. The harms, the risks will normally unfold for this very person that gives consent. In the data age, it's very different because data bodies are not bounded, and very often harms and benefits emerge for people who are not the data subjects from whom the original data come. So this challenges the work that individual consent alone can actually do. So we need to think of new ways in which we can facilitate data use that creates public value without posing any unacceptable risks. And if we want to do that, then we also need to look at what kind of data use creates public value. And we could now go off and have breakout groups and do literature reviews, which some of the latter we have already done in my group, actually, to look at what is public value. But an important part of answering this question is also to look at what people say is and consider value for them. So one could now say, okay, individual value is not the same as public value, I will argue that the two are actually very, very close together, and that is pitching, in many cases, not in all cases, and this pitching of individual interest against collective interests is mostly something that serves private and corporate profit interests. Very often, protecting individual privacy and collective privacy as a principle that we live by in our societies are very close together. So let's take a look at what people say. I already highlighted the really fantastic project at Cambridge, the UDNA USA study. I encourage everyone to go and check it out. It's, I think, to the best of my knowledge, the world's largest study on how people want data to be used, focusing on medical data, but not exclusively on medical data. And there are a range of countries that have participated in. And together with Thorsten Voigt, who's the first author on this paper here, I've had the privilege of leading the German arm of the study. And I'm going to zoom in, given the limited time, into the German data, because I think the German data illustrates something that is quite important, a larger argument that I want to make. So first of all, overall, not only looking at the German data, and this is a paper that was led by Anna Middleton, overall, when we ask participants in many countries of whether they would make their data available for research, then numbers overall are, and it depends on where you're coming from, sort of what is high and what is low for you, but I would say not overwhelming. For example, overall, we have 48% across all countries that would not donate their data, that would not make data available to medical doctors. 52% would. There's a majority that would, but still it's not overwhelming. With regard to for-profit companies, we see a very different picture. 2/3 would not donate, would not make available the data to for-profit companies, and 1/3 would. So this already illustrates that it's probably not all about individual privacy and data protection. Of course, one could argue that people trust their medical doctors more with their own data than they trust for-profit companies. But, and this is something that also other studies, for example, the wonderful Wellcome Trust study with Ipsos Mori on commercial data use, it's called the one-way mirror. Other studies showed that people care a lot about what value that their own data creates for other people. And I will return to that. But before that, I will continue with showing you some of the findings from the German part of the UDNA USA study. In the context of other countries, we see that the percentage of people willing to donate to make the data available for for-profit research or for non-for-profit medical research by medical doctors varies quite significantly. And so this raises the question, of course, why does it vary so much? What is the kind of cultural, how can the cultural national differences be explained? It can probably not be explained by saying, well, some people are more selfish than others, right? They're data hoarders. They are not sharing their data. I personally try to avoid the term data sharing because of the moralistic undertone. You might have noticed that I corrected my own language here, that I said making data available to instead of data sharing, because, you know, data sharing for a project that is likely to create significant value and to change people's lives for the better is a very different thing than sharing your data with a social media corporation. So I think the notion of data sharing obscures some of those differences. But the point here is there are really great differences between people's willingness to make the data available across countries. So why is that the case? So let us now zoom into the German example. that gives us part of an answer. The German sample consisted of about 1,500 participants. The Germans were, if you just look at this superficially, less willing to make data available, even even for research by medical doctors. It was consistently below the average of other countries. It also had a couple of other traits, other characteristics. For example, interestingly, in the German data set, we had fewer genetic exceptionalists. You know that genetic exceptionalism means that people treat genetic data or genetic information categorically different from other types of information. Interestingly, also, we found in the German sample that those who were more familiar with genetics and those who were more genetically exceptionalist were more likely to share their data, to make their data available, which means probably that those who had thought about medical research more than others, and especially genetic data for research, they were more likely to actually let others use their data. But overall, still, the German willingness to make data available was relatively low. We also had a couple of open questions where people wrote why they were not willing to share their data with doctors, with non-profit research, and also for-profit research. And I don't have time to actually go into what people said, but we found a strong indication, and we are now writing this up for another paper. We found strong indications that a lot of Germans felt that this right to informational self-determination meant that they had to make very good decisions about how their own data should be used. So rather than just saying, okay, you know, I sign everything, leave me alone, or I don't sign anything, leave me alone, they felt that they had to make a decision as a citizen. It was their citizen's duty to make a good decision on how their data should be used. So the right to informational self-determination, which plays quite an important role or a more important role, I should say, in Germany than in some other countries, also because of jurisdiction on this topic. It posed a positive duty on people to make prudent decisions and decisions that also mattered for others. So this is the conclusion that we drew. And if you have alternative interpretations of our data, I would like to hear them. Our conclusion was that the right to self-determination meant for people that they shouldn't just follow the crowd. So rather than saying, oh, you know, those Germans are sort of data hoarders and they are anxious, we can also say maybe they felt they had to make a good decision. And this is the Wellcome Trust report that I already mentioned, which I highly recommend for you to read. It's not super new anymore to 2016, but I think its findings are still very, very relevant today. That what this survey really showed was that people didn't care so much about whether they themselves would get a benefit from data use, but whether others benefited from data use, other people, not only corporations. They were not per se against corporations making profits with their data, but they should be fair and proportionate. Also, companies should be open about this. And they also felt, and this is partly our own research in this case that I've done with Susan Kelly a while ago, we found in a British sample over 10 years ago that whether or not people wanted to give individual consent or whether they were happy with broad consent to medical research depended on, it depended on whether they knew the researcher. So this is something that is not actually whether they knew the researcher, but whether the new research would be done by the same researcher. This is how I should put it. This is a hugely under-conceptualized aspect of trust and trustworthiness that for lots of people, trust is very personal. It's tied to people. that can be utilized, but it can also be abused, of course. So that's what people care about. And so they care not only in sort of selfishly, will my data be protected? Will my data have benefits for myself? But they care, what does it do for our society? And that's what I meant when I said individual interests and collective public value is very often close together, not always. Obviously, there are sometimes conflicts, but they're not in principle opposed to each other. This is something that I'm not going to go into, but I wanted to highlight this. This is something we found in one of the COVID studies that we've done. We're running a project in 10 European and 13 Latin American countries where we interview people about how they fare in pandemics. And when we looked at the contact tracing data and why people used or did not use contact tracing apps, really the striking finding, and this is published already, is that the concerns about privacy are mostly collective privacy concerns. So the typical stance was not to say, oh, I'm not going to use this app because I want my personal data to be safe, but people wanted to sometimes even override their own privacy concerns for the benefit of others. And when people had privacy concerns, they were very often about what type of society do we live in? Do we have too much surveillance in our society? Do we give our government too much power over us? How will it affect poor people? So these were the concerns that people brought to us, and we didn't ask them about it. You know, we asked just the general thing about whether they used contact tracing apps or not, and why not. So and to conclude in my remaining 5 minutes, I think we really need different instruments and governance approaches to govern data use. First of all, we need to think much more politically, not in terms of partisan politics and party politics, but politically about what do we datafy and what do we not datafy. Second, there's so many issues that individual control, such as enshrined in the General Data Protection Regulation, so many issues that individual control cannot solve. There are harms that emerge that individual control cannot solve. Think of the Cambridge Analytica scandal. Individual consent could not have prevented this. Many other harms that occur, individual consent cannot prevent it. So this is not to say that we should do away with individual consent, obviously. But in addition to having individual consent and individual level control, which has a number of downsides where it falls short, we also need instruments of collective control. So we need to strengthen instruments of collective oversight, control, and responsibility. And there are several approaches that try to do this. The data is labor approach, commons approaches, real commons approaches. Some commons approaches just carry the name of the commons, but not the spirit. But also what we have been promoting tries to do that, tries to increase collective control, which is solidarity-based data governance. And what does solidarity-based data governance try to do? As I said, it tries to complement individual level control by doing mainly three things. First, and I haven't talked about this so much, I've more talked about the sort of risks, but there are currently huge benefits of data use that cannot be obtained because certain data cannot be used. Data where there's individual consent, where individual consent is a requirement, and for practical reasons, this individual consent can no longer be given, and so on and so on. So I think in cases where data use could create significant public value without posing unacceptable risks to anyone, it needs to become easier to use data. And there are some initiatives underway also in the European domain that try to do that at the moment. Altruistic data donation is not one of them, by the way, in my view. The second pillar is that, we accept every society that uses data has people benefit, has people contribute to the benefits of the data, but usually it individualizes the harm. So if something happens, people have access to legal redress under GDPR, but this is very, very hard to get in practice. Sometimes because people don't even know what exactly happened, what exactly caused the harm, or because they don't have access to legal remedies for other reasons. So we need ombudsman-like structures that people can turn to when they have been harmed for data use. And we've written about that. If you're interested, I can say more about this, what this should look like. We call them harm mitigation bodies. And then the third pillar, and don't take the taxing very literal here, because there are good reasons for why an actual data use tax could be difficult. But whenever data are used for purposes that do not create a lot of public value, then some of the profits that come from this data use need to come back into the public domain. So these are the three pillars of solidarity-based data governance. I think they make data governance more fit for the digital era. And I think 20 seconds left, so I will stop here. And I thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to hearing what you think. Thank you.